While the new shock results Iowa poll from pollster Ann Selzer has been blowing up everybody's news feeds, and for good reason, it is just one poll, and we should put it in the context of what's going on more broadly in the polling as we're getting into the final polling before Election Day, including the big new poll from NBC News today. The top line of that one is that it's a tie, 49 for Harris, 49 for Trump. Even as the NBC poll shows a national deadlock, there's a couple of internal numbers that the pro-Harris side in particular is latching onto. For one, black voters in the NBC poll support Harris by a margin of 87% to 9%. In context, that's a 3-point larger margin with black voters than Biden won in 2020. Even though so much recent conversation about this campaign has centered on Harris supposedly having a slipping standing with black voters, in the NBC poll, she's doing better with black voters than Biden did. The NBC poll also shows a huge gender gap, which we're seeing in every poll, 34 points altogether. Women supporting Harris by 16, men supporting Trump by 18. Perhaps that is not surprising. On issues, Kamala Harris having a 20-point lead over Trump on the issue of abortion in the NBC poll. But there's a lot more here, and this is just part of the polling landscape as we do get our final look before actual vote starts to come in from actual voters on Tuesday. Let's bring in our friend Steve Kornacki, who was made for this and who is standing by at the big board with so much energy and stamina to spare. Steve, we're looking at you at the top of the mountain right now, my friend.
Well, here we go, Rachel. And look, when it comes to the polling right now, I think the safest thing to say is there are some extremely mixed signals that are coming in. You just talked about Iowa, obviously, a state Donald Trump won by nearly 10 points the last two elections. Now, at least in that Des Moines Register poll, having Harris slightly ahead. That it comes as this national poll shows Donald Trump, frankly, better position nationally than he finished in 2020 or 2016, and frankly, than he polled in either one of those elections, too. Our poll has it tied. Other national polls have it very much in this range of a tied race, maybe Harris by 1 or 2, maybe Trump by 1 or 2. That's a little different, and it leaves open lots of questions about what's going on in the battleground states and perhaps outside of the battleground states. We'll get to that in a minute, but looking inside our NBC poll here, there's the question of enthusiasm, which always gets to the variable of turnout here. These are folks from our poll who rate themselves with the highest level of interest in this election. It is at 77% in our poll. You can see that is down a little bit from 2020. We had historic high turnout in 2020, 160 million voters. This number 2, when you look inside, the lowest levels of high interest are coming from non-white voters, Latino voters and black voters. Two ways to view that. Obviously, you're talking about traditionally core Democratic constituencies. That could take away from Democratic overall margins with those groups. It could also be trouble for Donald Trump, though, because polling has shown previously him expanding support with non-white voters. If he's starting to lose those potential voters to lack of interest, that could be trouble for his campaign. Then you take a look here at the issues. It really, the climate we're seeing here is what we've seen the whole election. Harris's best advantage by far on the issue of abortion, 20 points over Trump on that. Trump here with the advantage on inflation and cost of living. The other one you don't see here, the biggest Trump advantage is the border and immigration. The gender gap, I think you talked about this one, but I mean, just to put this in context, Trump leading by 18 points with men, Harris leading by 16 with women, if that's what you get, something like that. That's a gender gap of 34 points. The previous high in history was 24 points. So this would absolutely shatter any historical record when it comes to the gender gap. Then there's this interesting issue of you've got an incumbent administration that Harris is a part of. Joe Biden's final approval rating in our poll is going to clock in at 41%. And obviously that low approval rating is one of the reasons there were Democrats who were anxious to get Biden out of this race earlier this year. Harris, part of that administration, how much is that weighting her down here? And then Trump himself, the approval rating for a former president seeking to become a future president. In our final poll here, when we ask people retrospectively, thinking back, do you now approve or disapprove of the job Donald Trump did as president? He's up to 48%, notably higher than Biden, and this is higher than any reading we ever got in an NBC poll when Donald Trump was president. So after leaving office, it has ticked up a little bit for him. Will that be enough to put him over the top? We talk all about the difference between early election day voting, the partisan disparities we're finding. Others are finding finding this too. Democrats, you can expect when early vote gets reported out, especially the mail-in vote on Tuesday night, should be some Democratic advantages. The Election Day vote becomes a question of how much of a Republican advantage when the people who vote on Election Day, when their votes start to get tabulated. Now we get to away from the national poll to the battlegrounds. This is our running average. We've been keeping this the entire summer and fall of the quality polls in all of the battleground states. And a couple things jump out here. Well, obviously, they're all close. You don't see a margin here of greater than 1.9 points. You do see a bit of a north-south divide. We've seen this lately in the polling. Trump's leads here, very small, but Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, basically Sun Belt states. Harris's best performance is in here. You know, Wisconsin, 1.4, 1.8 in Michigan. These are the northern tier states. 0.3 of a point in Pennsylvania. So a bit of a north-south divide. And if that holds, if that cements, that is ultimately good news for Harris, because Michigan plus Pennsylvania plus Wisconsin, if there are no surprises outside of the battleground, would for Harris equal 270 electoral votes. If the action really is limited to the battleground, Donald Trump has to win one of those three northern tier battleground states where our averages continue to show Harris with slight leads in those states. But then that gets to the question, if there are no surprises outside of the core 7 battleground states that we have talked over and over about, and that is what the Des Moines Register poll really gets to. It's the question of what is happening in Iowa itself, because obviously you talked to Ann Selzer right there. One of the questions is, does this spill over to other states? Does this reflect something, if this is what's happening in Iowa, that might be happening in other states, maybe states we haven't been talking about, maybe some of the other battleground states? So a couple ways to look at this. One, obviously, I think you were talking about this, but the issue of abortion exceptionally potent in Iowa because that 6-week ban went into effect this summer. Millions of dollars in spending there, not in the presidential race, but congressional races where abortion has been a driving issue. Is this more of a state-specific effect that's limited more to Iowa, if this is what is happening in Iowa? One thing to keep in mind, I think, we'll go over here. This is going to start lighting up on Tuesday with our results. Iowa on Tuesday, I just want to show you the history here going back. Remember, this is an Obama-Trump state. It's one of the most dramatic swings from Obama to Trump. So you have voters here who not long ago were comfortable voting Democratic, blue-collar white voters, huge blue-collar white population here that swung very hard to Trump. There are more Obama-Trump counties in Iowa than any other state in the country. I raised that because what state is number 2? That would be Iowa's political cousin right across the Mississippi River, Wisconsin. This has the second most Obama-Trump counties in the country, and demographically, these are extremely similar states. Large white populations, a lot of blue-collar, rural white populations. Even when you get into the Mississippi area, you can go back and find German descent is very common among people. Very common demographic features and politically similar movement here. We have not, for the most part, seen in Wisconsin the kind of polling shift we just saw in that new Iowa poll today. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If it potentially could be a state-specific thing, but if it's not, if it's spilling over, this is a place where you would expect to see it on Tuesday night because of those demographic similarities. And then, as I say, there's that question of, look, so much of the polling attention, the budgets for polling have been directed to the 7 battleground states. Is there actually something going on in Iowa? Was there something going on this whole time that was undetected? And could that be happening elsewhere? The early test you want to pay attention to on Tuesday night, 7 o'clock Eastern. A lot of the polls are going to close in New Hampshire. And this was a state, again, not in the battleground. Biden won by 7. The Trump folks think this thing is a lot closer than most people are talking about. They sent J.D. Vance there today. And remember, in 2016, Clinton won New Hampshire over Trump. Of all the Clinton won states, none was closer than New Hampshire. The margin was just 3,000 votes between those candidates. So this is an early test, I think, for me on Tuesday night. Have we potentially misunderstood the non-battleground states? If we're seeing some kind of surprise in New Hampshire, I think that'll be obviously a huge development.
Obviously interesting, too, in terms of Trump's decision to spend some just the beginning of what is going to be a beautiful relationship over these next many hours. Steve, thank you. We'll get back to you later on.